July 22, 2026. Somewhere between the strikes that hit Iran's coastline for months and the strikes that reached into the capital last week, something quieter happened. Something that has received almost no dedicated coverage anywhere, and it may end up mattering more than either of those two developments combined. The Quds Force, the branch of the IRGC responsible for building, funding, arming, and directing Iran's entire regional proxy network across Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria, has lost its three most senior regional coordinators in the span of 6 days. Not through a single dramatic strike package. Through a rolling sequence of individual operations that, examined separately, look like scattered developments in a busy news cycle, but examined together describe something much larger. The connective architecture linking Tehran to every proxy force it has spent 3 decades building is coming apart in real time. And the part of this story that almost nobody has connected yet is this. You can destroy every radar site, every missile launcher, every naval facility Iran possesses, and none of it actually ends the threat this regime has projected across the region for 30 years. Because that threat was never really about Iran's own military hardware. It was about the network of armed groups Iran built, funded, and directed far beyond its own borders. That network runs through specific people, and this week America started removing them. Let's back all the way up, because to understand exactly why the Quds Force occupies such a uniquely important position in this entire conflict, and why the loss of its regional coordinators represents a fundamentally different kind of damage than anything we have discussed in previous analysis of this war. You need to understand what the Quds Force actually is, and how differently it operates compared to every other branch of Iran's military. The IRGC's other branches, the Navy, the Aerospace Division, the ground forces, are fundamentally conventional military structures, however degraded they have become over the course of this conflict. They operate equipment, they occupy facilities, they follow chains of command that, while increasingly fractured, still resemble the kind of hierarchical military organization that exists in most countries. The Quds Force is different. It is Iran's expeditionary and unconventional warfare arm, the organization responsible for building and sustaining relationships with armed non-state actors far outside Iran's own territory. Hezbollah in Lebanon, various militia networks across Iraq, the Houthi movement in Yemen, and remaining elements of Iran's presence in Syria. These relationships are not built through formal military command structures. They are built through decades of personal relationships between specific Quds Force officers and specific proxy leaders. Financial networks that route money and weapons through channels these individuals personally understand and maintain. And operational trust built over years of shared history that cannot simply be transferred to a replacement officer through a change of command ceremony. This is the single most important thing to understand about why losing Quds Force coordinators produces a fundamentally different kind of damage than losing a naval commander or an aerospace officer. A naval commander's knowledge is about equipment and geography. A Quds Force coordinator's knowledge is about people, and people cannot be reissued from a supply depot. Here is the confirmed operational picture across the last 6 days. The first strike 6 days ago killed a senior Quds Force officer identified as the primary coordinator managing Iran's relationship with Iraqi militia networks. The individual responsible for the financial and logistical pipeline that has kept various Iraqi armed factions operationally supplied and financially sustained throughout this conflict. His death was reported briefly in regional coverage at the time, but was not connected, in any of the coverage available, to what would follow in the days after it. The second strike 4 days ago killed a Quds Force officer operating out of southern Lebanon. Identified by 2 separate intelligence sources as the primary liaison maintaining direct coordination between Tehran and Hezbollah's remaining senior military leadership. Read that carefully. This is not a minor administrative role. This is the specific individual who translated instructions from Tehran into operational guidance that Hezbollah's own commanders would actually trust and act upon. A role built on a specific personal relationship developed over more than a decade of direct engagement. Hezbollah does not take direction from an anonymous fax number in Tehran. It takes direction, historically, from specific individuals whose credibility and history with the organization gave their guidance operational weight. That individual is now dead. The third strike confirmed just 2 days ago. killed a senior Quds Force officer, identified as the coordinator overseeing what remains of Iran's logistical and advisory relationship with Houthi forces in Yemen. The individual responsible for the flow of weapons, technical expertise, and targeting guidance that has allowed Houthi forces to continue threatening shipping in the Red Sea and launching missile and drone attacks against Israel and Gulf state targets throughout this broader regional conflict. His death removes the specific individual who has personally overseen the transfer of increasingly sophisticated weapons technology to a group that, without that direct pipeline, faces a genuinely uncertain operational future. 3 coordinators, 3 separate proxy relationships: Iraq, Lebanon, Yemen. Each one killed in a distinct, separate operation rather than a single coordinated strike package, which is itself worth examining, because it tells you something important about how this specific campaign has been executed differently than the coastal infrastructure campaign or the mastermind strikes we have discussed in previous videos. This was not a single night of overwhelming force designed to produce shock and immediate operational paralysis. This was a rolling, sustained campaign executed over nearly a week, each strike independently planned and independently executed as specific intelligence and operational windows presented themselves. That pattern suggests a level of sustained, high-confidence intelligence penetration into Iran's proxy coordination network that goes far beyond a single lucky break or a single compromised communication. This is systematic, ongoing access to the exact individuals who matter most inside a network that Iran has spent decades trying to keep insulated from exactly this kind of targeting. Now let's talk about what this actually means for each of the 3 proxy relationships individually, because the consequences are not uniform. And understanding the specific damage in each theater matters enormously for understanding where this conflict goes next. In Iraq, the loss of the coordinator managing militia financial and logistical support arrives at a moment when several Iraqi militia factions have already been showing signs of operating with increasing independence from centralized Iranian direction, a trend that predates this conflict but has accelerated throughout it. Removing the specific individual who managed the financial relationships that kept these factions tied to Tehran's broader strategic direction does not necessarily mean these groups stop operating. It means they may increasingly operate according to their own institutional interests, rather than any coordinated Iranian strategy. Exactly the same fragmentation dynamic we have discussed extensively regarding Iran's own internal command structure, now potentially replicating itself across the wider network of armed groups Iran has spent decades cultivating. In Lebanon, the situation is, if anything, more consequential. Hezbollah has, for decades, represented the single most capable and most directly integrated element of Iran's entire regional proxy architecture. An organization with a level of military sophistication, political integration into Lebanese state structures, and direct coordination with Tehran that exceeds every other proxy relationship Iran maintains. The individual killed in this strike was not simply a messenger. He was, according to the intelligence assessment described by sources familiar with the operation, one of a very small number of Quds Force officers who had maintained the kind of direct personal trust with Hezbollah's senior military leadership that allowed genuinely sensitive coordination to occur without the layers of caution and verification that would otherwise be required between 2 organizations operating under this level of surveillance and targeting pressure. Rebuilding that specific kind of trusted relationship, even with a qualified replacement officer, does not happen quickly. It happens over years, and Iran does not currently have years to spare while the rest of its command structure is simultaneously collapsing under sustained pressure on every other front. In Yemen, the consequences are more immediately operational. The Houthi movement's ability to continue launching sophisticated missile and drone attacks depends directly on a continuous pipeline of components, technical expertise, and targeting intelligence that has been flowing from Iran for years, coordinated specifically through the individual killed in this strike. Without that specific coordinator, the pipeline does not necessarily stop immediately, but it becomes measurably less efficient, less responsive, and less capable of adapting to the kind of countermeasures that American and allied forces have been developing throughout this conflict specifically to address the Houthi threat. Every attack the Houthis have successfully executed against shipping in the Red Sea or against targets deeper in the region has, at some level, depended on the kind of technical support and targeting guidance that this specific individual's death now puts into question. Let's step back and examine the cumulative strategic significance of this six-day campaign. Because when you connect these three strikes to everything else we have discussed across the trajectory of this conflict, a much larger picture emerges. We have tracked the systematic destruction of Iran's coastal military infrastructure. We have tracked the elimination of the operational masterminds who understood how to use Iran's remaining equipment effectively. We have tracked strikes reaching directly into the capital, hitting the Joint Operations Directorate responsible for coordinating Iran's separate military branches. And now we are tracking the systematic dismantling of the specific human relationships that connected Tehran to its regional proxy network. Each of these campaigns has targeted a different layer of Iran's overall military and strategic architecture, but they share a single underlying logic. Iran's power throughout this conflict and for decades before it has never rested purely on the equipment it possessed. It has rested on the coordination, the relationships, and the institutional knowledge that connected that equipment, and the various armed groups aligned with it, into something resembling a unified strategic threat. Remove the equipment and you degrade Iran's capability. Remove the people who coordinated that equipment and those relationships, and you degrade Iran's capacity to function as a coherent strategic actor at all. Regardless of how much equipment technically remains somewhere in its possession or aligned with groups it has funded. Now let's talk about the reaction across Iran's proxy network itself. Because this dimension of the story extends beyond Iran's own internal politics into a question that regional analysts have been quietly raising for weeks. What happens to a proxy network when the specific individuals who built and maintain the trust holding it together are removed? Hezbollah's public statements following the death of its primary Quds Force liaison have been notably restrained compared to the maximalist rhetoric that has characterized official Iranian government. Statements throughout this conflict, acknowledging the loss but making no specific commitments about how or whether the relationship with Tehran's remaining coordination structure will be immediately reconstituted. That restraint is itself meaningful. An organization confident in the continuity and strength of its relationship with Tehran typically responds to this kind of loss with defiant rhetoric emphasizing the unbreakable nature of the alliance. Restrained procedural acknowledgement without the accompanying rhetorical commitment suggests an organization that is, at minimum, taking a measured pause to assess exactly what this loss means for its own operational relationship with a partner whose broader command structure is visibly fragmenting under sustained pressure on every other front simultaneously. Let's talk about what this means for the ongoing negotiations, because this question, as it has throughout every phase of this conflict, becomes more complicated rather than less with each new development. Any eventual ceasefire or negotiated resolution to this conflict has always faced the question of whether an agreement between the United States and whatever remains of Iran's central government leadership would actually translate into a halt in activity from the various proxy groups operating under Iranian sponsorship across the region. That question was already difficult given everything we have discussed about the fragmentation of Iran's own internal command structure. It becomes significantly more difficult when the specific individuals who represented the operational link between Tehran and these proxy groups are being systematically removed. A ceasefire signed in Doha does not automatically bind Hezbollah, does not automatically bind Iraqi militia factions, and does not automatically bind Houthi forces in Yemen, particularly if the individuals who would have been responsible for communicating and enforcing that ceasefire across those relationships are no longer present to do so. This is the uncomfortable structural reality underlying any diplomatic resolution to this conflict. Even a successful negotiation with whatever remains of Iran's central leadership may not actually end the broader regional violence this conflict has generated, because that violence increasingly flows through relationships and networks that operate with growing independence from Tehran's central direction. A dynamic that this six-day campaign against Quds Force coordinators has now measurably accelerated. Now let's talk honestly about what remains of Iran's regional strategic architecture after this week, because the picture, examined cumulatively, is genuinely significant. For 3 decades, the Quds Force represented Iran's most successful strategic investment. The mechanism through which a country with genuinely limited conventional military capability, compared to its adversaries in the region, projected power far beyond its own borders through a network of armed proxy groups that gave Tehran influence and leverage across Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, and Syria without requiring Iran to directly deploy its own conventional forces into any of those conflicts. That architecture took decades to build. It depended at every level on specific individuals who maintained the trust, the relationships, and the institutional knowledge that turned a network of geographically dispersed armed groups into something resembling a coordinated regional strategy. This week, 3 of the most senior individuals responsible for maintaining that architecture across 3 separate theaters were killed within a span of 6 days. The equipment those proxy groups possess has not disappeared. The ideological commitment that sustains many of these organizations has not disappeared. But the specific coordination mechanism that turned scattered armed groups into a unified regional strategic asset for Tehran has just absorbed one of the most significant blows in its entire history. The honest strategic assessment as of tonight is this. Every other dimension of this conflict we have examined, the coastal infrastructure, the operational masterminds, the strike into Tehran itself, has focused on degrading Iran's capability to fight directly. This 6-day campaign against Quds Force coordinators represents something categorically different. It is degrading Iran's capacity to project power beyond its own borders at all, striking directly at the mechanism that has made Iran's regional influence possible for 3 decades regardless of what happens to its own domestic military infrastructure. If Iran's coastal defenses are eventually rebuilt, if its command structure eventually reconstitutes around new leadership, the country still faces the question of whether the specific human relationships that connected Tehran to Hezbollah, to Iraqi militias, to the Houthis, can ever be rebuilt to the same degree of trust and operational effectiveness that took 3 decades to construct in the first place. That is not a question that gets answered in weeks or months. It is a question that may define the actual shape of Iran's regional influence for years after this specific conflict eventually concludes. Regardless of how the current phase of strikes and negotiations ultimately resolves, what happens next depends on whether Tehran, in the middle of managing a fragmenting domestic command structure, an invisible supreme leader, and a coastal military infrastructure that has been systematically reduced to rubble, still has the institutional capacity to identify, deploy, and establish trusted relationships with replacement coordinators fast enough to prevent its regional proxy network from beginning to operate with the same kind of independent, uncoordinated fragmentation that has already come to define Iran's own internal military command. 3 decades of carefully constructed regional architecture does not collapse in 6 days. But 6 days ago, it did not have 3 of its most important connective points removed simultaneously either. Whether that architecture survives in any recognizable form is now, for the first time in this entire conflict, a genuinely open question. And neither Tehran nor the groups it has spent decades cultivating currently have a confirmed answer to it.